Hello and welcome to ADMA's webinar on spam and related issues. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all meet. For me, it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would particularly like to pay respects to any First Nations people who are at the webinar today. We are honoured to have as our guests representatives of the Australian Communications and Media Authority, or as this community refers to them as ACMA. The ACMA is Australia's media and communication regulator and oversees compliance in the areas of spam, telemarketing, scams, amongst other things. Joining us from the ACMA today, we have Authority Member Samantha York and Manager Compliance and Intelligence, Evan Westmore. From ADMA, the Association for Data-Driven Marketing and Advertising, we have the Chair of our Regulatory and Advocacy Working Group, Peter Leonard, and my colleague, Manager of Regulatory and Policy, Dr. Rob Nichols. I'm super excited about the conversation we're going to be having today on such an important area of marketing. This is apparent as well by the over 1,400 registrations we've had for today's session. Just a quick overview of how the session will unfold. First up, ADMA will present an overview of key elements of telemarketing and spam compliance. This will be followed up with some insights from Authority Member Samantha York, and then a panel discussion where Sam and I will be joined by Evan, Peter and Rob for what I'm sure will be a valuable and interesting conversation. We will also have a short Q&A towards the end of the webinar. I'm sure many of you will have plenty of questions for our panelists today. Please submit these to the Q&A box and we will endeavour to answer as many questions during the webinar as possible. We will also then do our best to respond to any unanswered questions after the webinar has concluded. Before we continue, ADMA would like to ask you a quick poll question. How would you rate your understanding of how the Spam Act applies in marketing today? Okay, so the majority of people think that they have a basic understanding but need more clarity. Okay, well that's good, because here to provide us with further clarity is my esteemed colleague, Dr. Rob Nichols. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks very much, Sala. As Sala mentioned, I'm Rob Nichols and I'm coming to you from Gadigal land. I'll be running through some material on telemarketing and spam before we hear from Sam York and then have that broader discussion. I'm going to start by providing some context as to where both the Spam Act and the rules on telemarketing come from. The basic position flows from privacy law. This in turn has its basis in international human rights agreements. The fundamental position is set out in the Privacy Act and the associated Australian privacy principles. These are supplemented by state-based privacy laws, and specific aspects of privacy have their own rules. These are things like data breach notifications, rules associated with health information, and the consumer data right. The rules for specific channels are provided in the Spam Act, the Do Not Call Register Act, and telemarketing standards. You'll notice that the Spam Act is more than 20 years old, and the Do Not Call Register Act is only a few years younger. When the Spam Act first came in, Google was 5 years old. Facebook and Twitter, or X, did not exist, and there'll be a 5-year wait for the first iPhone. Managing wanted and unwanted communications has a long history. Most pieces of law have a regulator. In our communications with customers, the laws and regulations are enforced by the Australian Communications and Media Authority, or ACMA. Sam and Evan, who we'll hear from later, are from the ACMA. Sala introduced a narrow set of issues that the ACMA deals with, but it has a very wide set of responsibility. It regulates communications and media to contribute to maximising the economic and social benefits of communications infrastructure, services, and content for Australia. Each year, the ACMA publishes its enforcement priorities, and these tend to be customer-oriented. I'm going to start by looking at telemarketing. The Do Not Call register is at the heart of telemarketing rules. This allows people to put their number on a register so they won't get calls that they don't want. Telemarketers must not call numbers on that list, and it's really important to get the order of things clear. If you have a customer that's given you their number, you can only call them if they've given you consent to call. If they're not on the Do Not Call register, and that's not very many numbers, it's still useful and safest to get consent for that telemarketing call in advance. It's also to realise that consent that you give is time limited. Once you have consent to make a call, that consent's only valid for 3 months by default. And even at 3 months, many people who have numbers on the Do Not Call register might find that call intrusive. The other thing is that once a number's on the register, it's effectively there forever. People can remove their numbers, but there's really very little reason to do so. Beyond the Do Not Call Register Act, the 2017 telecommunications industry standards further protect customers and consumers from intrusive telemarketing practices. These standards prioritise the rights of call recipients, ensuring that calls are made at reasonable times, callers clearly identify themselves, and individuals can easily end unwanted conversations. It's a framework designed to strike a balance between legitimate business needs and the customer's right to privacy and peace of mind. The customer rights create obligations on telemarketers, and these arise both at the start of the call and, if the person who's being called says so, during the call. So at the start of the call, you need to let your customers know, or the person calling needs to let them know, first name and reason for calling. You have to also say the name of the business that wanted the call made in the first place. If the customer asks, you need to be able to provide the contact details of the employer of the caller, remembering that might not be the business that set up the call. You also need to be able to let the person called know who is responsible for complaints or inquiries. What that means is having scripts ready in the telemarketing centre for standard requests. And perhaps the most important rule, at least from the customer side, is that you must hang up if the person that you call asks you to do that. Another important issue is caller identification. Even if you can find somebody who actually answers a call with no caller ID, you're not allowed to display it. On the other hand, you can choose the number that you do display. However, the numbers must be able to take calls. That obligation lasts 30 days after the date of the call. And this is one of those areas that turns out it's really important that marketing and IT work together. Saying the number was lost as part of a transformation is not a defense for breaching this rule. When somebody calls back on that number, they have to be able to obtain the business that made the call, the purpose, and who authorized the call. Remember, this has to work for 30 days after the last call made with your chosen caller ID. This means either an inbound telecenter with appropriate scripting or a recording. Making customers listen to recordings doesn't tend to lead to strong business relationships. There are a limited range of calls which are exempt from the rules that I've just described. They're specific and generally for the benefit of the customer. As you can see, they relate to faults, scheduling, payment, and callbacks. That's it. The exemptions are very specific. There are a range of organisations which are exempt, and many of us will have experience of receiving calls from these. They are registered charities, government bodies, which tend to have no caller ID to add to confusion, registered political parties, and education institutions. For the education institutions, their exemption is restricted to calling existing or past students, that is, not prospective ones. I'm now going to move on to the Spam Act. So, how do you know if your marketing message falls under the Spam Act? Well, the first question to ask is it a commercial electronic message? To be classified as such, it needs to meet two criteria. It must be an electronic message and it must serve a commercial purpose. I'll look at commercial purpose in a moment, but electronic messages encompass a wide range, including texts, picture messages, email, and instant messages. Essentially, if it's a digital communication, it likely falls into an electronic message. That WhatsApp group chat that you set up for customers, it's in. So, your message is likely to be electronic. But is it for a commercial purpose? This is where the Spam Act gets more specific. Your message is considered commercial if it's promoting goods, services, real estate, business opportunities, or investments. And this applies even if you're just promoting the supplier, not the product itself. Additionally, the Act covers messages that might assist in deceptive practices like scams. So, it's critical to be mindful of the intent and potential impact of a message. If you have a happy birthday DM with a discount code as a birthday present, it has a commercial purpose. The other type of message is a transactional or service one. We can think of these as essential communications that facilitate existing agreements or relationships. So examples include order confirmations, shipping notifications, warranty information, account balance updates, or messages about employee benefits. One important aspect here is the message is about something where there's an existing commercial arrangement between the customer and the person sending the message. They're predominantly after-sales messages. However, the key here is that these messages serve a functional purpose and not a promotional one. Some messages have mixed content. That's because in the real world, marketing messages aren't always black and white. You often see a blend of commercial and transactional content, and those can be within the same communication. This is called mixed content. It's quite common for businesses to include a bit of promotion alongside essential information. However, it's really important to remember that even if the commercial aspect is secondary, the entire message falls under the Spam Act. Perhaps it's easiest to think of it this way. If you add a dash of marketing to an otherwise informational message, the whole thing needs to comply with the rules. This includes having an unsubscribe link. It means it's really important to tread carefully when you mix content. Better to err on the side of caution. If in doubt, think it's mixed. And there are also some warnings here. So Google is my friend. However, Google is less of a friend when it comes to spam rules. And I promise this isn't a slide about search engine optimization. However, on the top of this search is the ACMA and their link and a link to their resources on spam. Really very useful. However, to the right is the Google box, and that's on the American CAN-SPAM Act of 2003. Same year, some of the legislation sounds the same, but the CAN-SPAM Act does not apply here. Worse, if you follow the information provided there, you'll find that mixed content is treated differently under US law. The next result on this page from Google is the Australian Law Reform Commission. The one after that is from the Federal Trade Commission in the US. This has a similar approach to regulation as the ACMA. It has a really high level of really useful guidance, all of which is almost certainly unsuitable for Australia. Of course, number 4 in this organic search is ADMA and some of our resources on Spam Act compliance. So let's have a look back at the key points where the Spam Act comes into play. It primarily governs electronic messaging. That's all of those things like email, text messages, instant messages, and related apps. It's not the blanket rule for all digital communications. The Spam Act focuses specifically on commercial messages, those with sales or promotional content. To stay compliant, you need to ensure that you have the recipient's consent, either express or inferred. Your messages need to clearly identify the sender, including contact information. And finally, you mustn't forget that all commercial electronic messages must have a functional unsubscribe facility. You need to make it easy for people to opt out if they choose. I'm going to run through consent, identifying the sender, and functional unsubscribe in a little bit more detail. So, consent means getting the right consent from the recipient before you send them any type of marketing message. And the Spam Act outlines 2 different types of consent: inferred and express. Express consent is where the recipient of the message opts in to receive your messages. And that opt-in could be ticking a box via a website, via a phone, via an app, face-to-face, completing a form. Not only do they need to provide express consent, but you need to be able to prove that they've done that. That means keeping a record of when they provided permission and who gave that permission. This is particularly helpful as a practical matter where the customer has withdrawn consent, yet somehow got back opted in to your messaging. Inferred consent is where it's reasonable to assume a person would want to receive your marketing messages and messages from your business. This is most often where there's an existing business relationship and your message is relevant to that relationship. To comply with the Spam Act, your electronic marketing needs to include your identity and your business contact details. These details should be clearly displayed on each message. That's not hard. That's what good marketing practice is anyway. Remember though, if you use a third-party service to send your messages, the message itself must clearly identify you as the authorizing business. And this information needs to stay accurate for at least 30 days after the message is sent. Think of it as a way of building trust and accountability with your customers. I mentioned earlier the issue in telemarketing about 30 days after the last message having problems with transformation programs. It's also critical here. That 30-day rule applies to 30 days after the last message was sent. And to comply with the Spam Act, messages need to have an easy way for people to unsubscribe. It also needs to be clearly worded so people know what they need to do. It shouldn't require users to provide any more information or set up an account. Any requests to unsubscribe need to be honored quickly, within 5 working days. And that live link needs to be available, as I mentioned, for 30 days. An unsubscribe feature will often be built into your emails if you're using a reputable email marketing platform. There is nuanced unsubscribe. Instead of having a single option for a person to unsubscribe from every single message from your organization, you can let customers choose which messages to opt out from a list of options, like news, product updates, newsletters, or marketing emails. However, you must provide an option to unsubscribe from all. Providing customers with choices may be helpful to your customers. There was a report in August 2024 from the Consumer Policy Research Centre, or CPRC. Their work looked at unsubscribing from a range of services, not just electronic messages with a commercial purpose. However, it's worthwhile looking at some of the headline results from that work. One is that 48% of Australians have spent more time than they intended in trying to cancel a subscription. Another is that 3/4 of Australians with subscriptions have had some form of negative experience when trying to cancel a subscription. And the most important of all, at least to me, 90% of Australians would likely purchase from the same organisation if cancelling a subscription process was quick and simple. In light of those CPRC results, it's worth talking about what not to do when somebody wants to unsubscribe. The Spam Act and its regulations set clear rules to ensure that the process is simple and hassle-free for customers. When somebody clicks the subscribed link, they must not be asked for more personal information. You're not allowed to make them jump through hoops, like only being able to subscribe from a premium service or requiring them to log into an account or to pay a fee. The unsubscribe process must be straightforward and free of charge. Remember, the goal is to respect your customers' preferences, not create additional barriers. Making it difficult to unsubscribe can lead to frustration and damage of brand reputation. And if upsetting customers is not enough of an incentive, then it's worth considering the penalties. This is not just the Pizza Hut penalty of 2.5 million in May 2024, Luxottica of 1.5 million in April 2024, or Outdoor Supercentres 300,000 in January 2024, or the ones on the slide. The reality is that the cost of penalties is only a small part of the cost to the business. For a start, there's a problem that needs to be fixed. For most businesses, this ends up being the type of root and branch review which involves the whole of the C-suite. That's a significant amount of management time. It's also likely that as part of the settlement of the penalty, the ACMA will have asked for an enforceable undertaking. That's not just a promise not to do it again. It also requires that that root and branch review be monitored and assessed by an independent expert. And that expert typically reports to the C-suite and the ACMA at the same time, not one before the other. Breaching a federal court enforceable undertaking is also problematic. Not only does it mean more penalties, but the ACMA might consider taking another couple of courses of action. One is that you've clearly engaged in misleading or deceptive conduct in offering the undertaking and not living up to it. And the other is, in extreme cases, arguing that a breach of a court enforceable undertaking is contempt of court. That leaves your choice as to whether the CEO or the CMO is in contempt. But even more important for all of this, if you get the corrections done properly and in good time, and you put that management time into it, the reputational harm will still take a long time from which to recover. There's a simple solution here. Get telemarketing and spam compliance right. And if you needed even more incentive, the ACMA's compliance priorities for 2024 include targeting misleading spam messages. That's enough for me. The next speaker is my friend and ACMA authority member, Sam York. Sam is an accredited mediator, technology lawyer, and policy advisor with over 24 years' experience working in digital media and technology sectors, both in Europe and the Asia Pacific. Before being appointed as an ACMA authority member, Sam worked in Google's government affairs and public policy team, leading their privacy, online safety, scam and disinformation efforts in Australia. I'll hand over to Sam.
Thank you, Rob. And thank you all for spending your lunch break with us today to learn more about your responsibilities under the spam and telemarketing rules. I want to also thank the ADMA team for inviting the ACMA to participate today, and I'd like to acknowledge that I am joining you from Gadigal land. So we're all aware, I think, that unwanted marketing communications can create distress, anxiety, and annoyance for Australians. And depending on the type of product being marketed, it can also have significant impacts for people, including those in vulnerable circumstances. As you've heard from Rob's excellent introduction, Australia's spam and telemarketing laws provide important consumer protections from unsolicited marketing calls and messages. However, they also contain some inconsistencies which can be confusing for industry to understand, particularly around the very vexed issue of consent. They're also, frankly, getting a little old. As Rob highlighted, the Spam Act is turning 21 this year, and while the Do Not Call Register Act is celebrating its 18th birthday. So the ACMA receives about 30,000 consumer complaints every year about marketing messages and calls that potentially breach these laws. And you might be interested to know that consent is an issue in more than 90% of these complaints. It's also been shown as a key concern in research that we've commissioned and is the predominant issue identified through the ACMA's investigations and enforcement actions, some of which Rob touched on earlier. So in response to this, on the 1st of July this year, the ACMA released a statement of expectations on the use of consumer consent in direct marketing. This statement of expectations provides guidance to businesses that market by phone or electronic messaging, or indeed a combination of both. It's focused on making sure businesses can meet both the minimum legal requirements, but also, equally as important, consumer expectations. It's not a regulatory guide. While many of the expectations do reflect existing obligations under the law and regulations, it also includes best practice examples that either meet or exceed current regulatory obligations. It's important to remember that, unlike the Privacy Act, all businesses, small, medium, large, must comply with the spam and telemarketing laws and regulations. Our statement of expectations is intended to help businesses navigate these rules and meet their customer expectations. We want businesses to be confident that if they follow the advice provided, that their practices should be compliant. The statement of expectations also sets out some key examples of both consumer-friendly and consumer-unfriendly practices. As set out in the statement, best practice generally means that a business is getting express consent based on clear terms and conditions that are accessible to their customers. Terms and conditions should explain clearly what the marketing is for, who will use it, how long it will be used, and how to withdraw their consent. It also sets out some key examples of what not to do, such as using strategies like refer a friend marketing to build your contact lists, using pre-checked boxes in forms, using unsubscribe facilities that only allow a consumer to opt out of some types of marketing but not all, or indeed contacting past customers who have unsubscribed to try to re-engage with them. Now, each year, the ACMA targets areas for improved industry compliance from across its remit. As Rob highlighted in his introduction, in 2024 and 2025, we're specifically targeting misleading spam messages as one of our compliance priorities. We'll be focusing on enforcing the spam rules to stop commercial messages being misleadingly sent as service or non-commercial messages. And Rob explained the difference between those in his introduction. This especially applies to messages from businesses where there may be a high risk of harm to consumers, like interactive wagering or financial services. We'll also be focusing on compliance within the online retail sector by educating businesses about spam rules and taking formal action where serious or systemic matters are found to exist. Another of our compliance priorities that I thought it might be worth mentioning today is the continuing of our development of the SMS Sender ID register. And this is a register which is aiming to stop Australians from receiving impersonation scams by protecting alphanumeric sender IDs or alpha tags of legitimate brands, businesses, and government services from being hijacked by scammers. So these are the messages that pretend to be from the ATO or from MyGov or from the post office. This register is currently in a trial phase with most of the banks, the ATO, Services Australia, and some telcos participating. And the legislation giving the ACMA the powers to operate this register were recently passed through Parliament and the Minister is currently deciding whether the register should be mandatory or voluntary. But regardless of whether it's mandatory or voluntary, it would be great to see more brands that risk being impersonated by scammers signing up to the register. Do let us know if you're interested to learn more. The ACMA takes its compliance and enforcement responsibilities very seriously. We take a graduated and proportionate approach, and we focus on the risk of harms in every investigation that we conduct. Where a person has complained about a call or a message and we think there may be a compliance issue, our first step in pretty much all cases is to write to the business directly to inform it that we've received a complaint and to provide some information about how to comply. If we are worried about ongoing serious or systemic non-compliance, we may choose to investigate. And there can be serious consequences if we find that you've broken the rules, and Rob has outlined those. The ACMA has a range of enforcement actions that it can take, including giving a formal warning, issuing an infringement notice, and accepting a court enforceable undertaking requiring certain action to be taken. The ACMA can also take action in the federal court to seek pecuniary penalties and/or injunctions in the worst case scenarios. Infringement notices currently start at $3,130 for a single breach of the rules, and they can go up to $313,000 per day that a breach is ongoing. Over the past 18 months, businesses have paid more than $13 million in spam and telemarketing penalties. The largest infringement notice paid to date for a breach of the Spam Act was for over $3.5 million paid by the Commonwealth Bank in June 2023. If breaches are found by the courts, the penalties can, of course, be much higher than this. The largest court penalties for Spam Act breaches to date was for $15.75 million in 2009. If you need to find out more information about the spam and telemarketing laws, please feel free to visit the ACMA's website, acma.gov.au, and the Do Not Call Register website. We've also recently published a page on our site highlighting the common issues and mistakes that we see through our compliance and enforcement work, which is a really useful resource for you to have a read through. Links to all of these resources will be provided at the end of the webinar. But I'll hand back to Sala now to kick off the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those valuable insights, Sam. I'm sure the ADMA community has a much better understanding of the role of the ACMA in this important area. Now let's dive into some detail and a very exciting conversation. And I'd like to invite our wonderful panelists to join us, Peter Leonard, Evan Westmore, and Rob Nichols. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here today. We've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to dive in straight away with our first question, okay? In building consumer trust, what strategies should marketers develop that build engagement rather than annoyance in their sending out of electronic messages? How can the ACMA help marketers in this regard to meet consumer expectations and comply with the law? I might throw to you first, Peter, and then maybe Evan, if you'd like to jump in from the ACMA.
Thanks, Sala. Look, I think the two key words are transparency and clarity. And often the problems arise because organisations are not clear and transparent at the time that they seek consents. And that creates difficulties not only in establishing that there was an informed consent by the consumer to the sending of a commercial electronic message, it can also be counterproductive to the organisation, because when an individual elects to unsubscribe, it's difficult for the organisation to comply with the principle that it should be as easy to unsubscribe as it was to subscribe. And often individuals will have different views as to different channels of communication. So, for example, I don't mind consenting to receive commercial electronic messages by email from organisations that I regard as my favoured parties. But I have a very different view in respect of SMS, which I regard as a much more immediate and intrusive form of communication. So if an organisation has not elected to separately seek consent by channel for each of those two channels, it's more difficult for it if I elect to unsubscribe to get me to unsubscribe from the channel that is really annoying me, but stay subscribed for the other channel, which I don't regard as annoying. So I think that there is nuance to the process of seeking consent, and it is often to the benefit of the organisation to understand that nuance, because it may also, for the reason that I just said, give them greater control as to when the subscriber seeks consent, what it is that seeks to withdraw consent, what it is that they're withdrawing consent from. The other thing I wanted to say quickly is that many organisations, from my experience, get wrong the concept of withdrawing consent and appear to think that if they provide a functional unsubscribe facility, that's the only means by which a customer may elect to unsubscribe, that is, to withdraw consent. And that actually isn't correct. A functional unsubscribe facility must be provided as a statutory obligation, but a consumer can elect to unsubscribe from commercial electronic messages in a variety of ways, including calling up your call centre, sending you an email, writing you a letter, and so on. So organisations need to think about their business processes to accommodate the range of ways in which consumers may elect to interact with them, and not merely seek to channel all consumer communications through the functional unsubscribe facility or such other channel as an organisation might regard as its preferred channel, rather than a reasonable mechanism for consumers to elect to unsubscribe.
A really good point there, Peter. I think a lot of the time we do find that businesses have forgotten that last step of syncing their database. And that's where a lot of the continuing communications when people have withdrawn that consent does continue. Evan, is there anything that you'd like to add from the ACMA's perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Peter. And look, I'd echo a number of those sentiments. I think what shouldn't get lost in all of that is, consumers have a lot more choice now. Marketers have a lot of different options available to them in how they communicate to their consumers. What we shouldn't lose sight of, though, is the scenario where a consumer wants to withdraw from all of your marketing activities. So there needs to be an option there to unsubscribe from all, not just select channels. But at a sort of a broader level, what we're talking about here is exactly the aim of our statement of expectations. And you might want to think about that as a guide. Statement of expectations is a very government term, but essentially this is a best practice guide. It's designed to help businesses meet both their minimum legal obligations and, just as importantly, and I suspect possibly for a lot of you, more importantly, consumer expectations. So we receive anywhere from 30,000 complaints up to 50,000 complaints a year, many of which include commentary from the complainant. You won't be surprised to learn that not all of that is complimentary towards the business that they're complaining about. So we get a lot of feedback from consumers about what they don't like. And what they don't like is feeling like they're being tricked, or that the business is engaging in underhand tactics in order to sign them up to a mailing list. And they especially don't like it when you keep sending them marketing messages after they've asked you to stop. So we'd argue that any commercial advantage that you might be hoping to get from these sorts of practices would be more than outweighed by the reputational damage that would be done to your business or brand.
Thanks, Evan, and that's a really good point, because at the end of the day, I think we're comfortable hearing certain messages from brands that we trust. So I think all of that, meeting the customer's expectations, definitely builds that trust and probably opens the door for them being willing to hear from you a lot more. So it's respecting them. I think that's a core thing that we get from that. Okay, I'm going to move to the second question. What spam trends are you seeing in the Australian market, particularly within less traditional channels such as social media, apps, bots, SMS, and instant messaging? And what would we regard as best practice, and how is the ACMA adapting its enforcement strategies to address these new challenges? So that was long, but...
I think I got all of it. Thank you. So look, it won't surprise you to learn that the trends we're seeing are generally all based around the adoption of new or emerging technologies. At a more basic level, we're seeing a move to much more towards SMS and away from more traditional channels like email, and telemarketing in particular is becoming a lot less common as a genuine marketing tactic anyway. We are seeing a gradual increase about instant messages, and we anticipate that we'll see similar increases in relation to push notifications as well. But in terms of marketing practices, in terms of marketing practices, we're also seeing some compliance issues arise out of some new methods. So welcome journey message chains, we're seeing some issues with those where the concept of unsubscribe is perhaps not introduced until some way into that journey, whereas we've got complaints from consumers who want to unsubscribe right at the first message. The move towards paperless receipts, which can often result in the customer being sent commercial messages that they didn't consent to receive. So there's a particular risk around consent gathering at that point in time. And from an enforcement perspective, look, our strategies don't necessarily change that much. It's more about understanding these emerging technologies and trends and how businesses are using them, and in particular where those risks are. So again, Sam mentioned that we have published some advice about some of the common issues and mistakes that we see through our complaint handling and our investigation and enforcement action. And a number of those issues that I've just mentioned at a high level there are covered off in that bit of advice as well.
I agree with that, because at the end of the day, I suppose it's taking the concept and the components of the Spam Act, which, quite simple components, and then applying it to the communication, whichever the channel is. So I think it involves the marketer putting some thought as to, well, okay, if you have to identify, you have to provide consent, and you have to provide a way of withdrawing that consent, then I guess that's up to the marketer to think how that happens in each of the individual channels.
I think one of the key risks with these emerging technologies is automation, and it's very attractive, I can imagine, from that perspective in terms of what some of the bells and whistles are, but it also introduces some further risk around those practices. So that's the key from our perspective.
I think the paperless receipts example is an interesting one, because it is an example of an initiative within an organisation that might be introduced for customer convenience, but which in some organisations would not necessarily get channeled through a change control process that might bring to the attention of the marketer that this is another way in which information is being gathered about a consumer, and there may or may not be appropriate consent gathered at that point. One of the big challenges I find in spam compliance is that it really requires a well joined up team approach within an organisation to keep hygiene in the CRM or other database, which is the source of truth as to customer consents, and the various ways in which an organisation interacts with a consumer, including for what might be regarded as purely operational communication, such as a paperless receipt. So unless there's really joined up review of business processes and thought about spam compliance, when a new feature is added that may be an operational feature, there is a real risk that a previously assessed marketing database may be used in ways that weren't assessed at that time. So as I say, it requires a really kind of joined up approach of the compliance personnel, the marketing teams, the custodians of the CRM, and anyone else that might be making changes in the way that an organisation communicates with consumers.
And to amplify that, Peter, and to take Evan's example of automation, in many businesses, well, we're only automating what we currently do, so we don't need to worry about some of the compliance issues, is the first approach that you take. Because actually, if you're doing that automation, the last thing you want to do is check back to all of these people who'll just have something to say about it. But in reality, that this is the most important part, and it is making sure that you have all those issues of transparency, of being able to comply with the legislative requirements, but more importantly, to do it in a way that you're not going to upset customers because you've chosen to take a path which is more cost efficient, for example, by automation. So I think Evan's point is really important there. The other issue, I think, which has the same story, is using a different channel. So using a bot instead of an email doesn't change the fundamental nature of the communication with the customer, and ensuring that fundamental nature of the interaction complies with the Spam Act. Actually, now this is one of those situations, I'll use Sala's expression, the law is the floor. Actually, if you're going to have a long-term relationship with your customers, you simply don't want to upset them. And you certainly don't want the first thing they want to do is complain to the ACMA that the unsubscribed facility that you didn't think was as important, because this really will delight you as a customer, isn't working in the way that it should.
I agree. I think it's very much as well a marketer would be a little bit more enthusiastic. Of course, they want to hear more about our product. They've purchased it, when they ask for a receipt, they want to hear more about that. When actually, if we haven't provided the right transparency, the customer genuinely might just want a receipt. So I think that's something that we really need to be thinking about when we are employing these new emerging technologies and efficiencies and all of that that's there for business. It's actually, the thing about being a marketer is you are also a customer, right? So before you take that step in what you're applying to your marketing communications, maybe take a step back and go, actually, how would I like to receive it when I'm on the customer side? Because I think that really does also help.
I think, Sala, even more, how would I feel as a customer if it came from my competitor? Because I'd be first to be complaining about it if it worked that way.
Yeah, and I think that goes straight to the digital trust, right? When a brand takes that into consideration, then you trust them more and you don't mind hearing from them about certain things. It's like I always say, don't get creepy, okay? Okay, I'm going to move to the next question because this is actually something that has been a topic of conversation for quite a while. A marketer's aim is to engage the customer in all communications, whether that is a transactional one or a commercial one. Furthermore, it's a responsibility for a brand to clearly identify that they are the sender of an electronic communication. A message with no live link to a homepage could appear to be a scam. How does a brand tackle sending transactional messages without it crossing the line into being a marketing message?
Thanks, Alan. Nice and easy one. Yeah, look, we appreciate this is a perennial challenge. I think it helps to take a step back here a little and come at this from a principles-based approach. So as Rob went over before, the definition of a commercial message in the Spam Act includes consideration of content located using links set out in the message. And it allows for a scenario where the advertising or promotion of goods or services might be a purpose, but not the main purpose of the message. So if you have a message where the main purpose is transactional, but it still includes links to content that's commercial, then it still could be considered commercial and you could be in breach. So there's a threshold question there. Do those links lead to commercial content? Do you need to have links in there? And maybe rather than getting wrapped up in a discussion about how commercial your homepage might be or how commercial the content on your social media feed might be, we'd suggest that you ask that threshold question: do we need to engage with this risk in the first place? Now, if the argument is that you need to still make the message look legitimate, like a legitimate one, sorry, from your business, is there something that you can link to that doesn't engage that risk? So a flat contact us page. Is there something already on your website that that doesn't include commercial content but still ticks that box in terms of giving the consumer some sort of assurance or comfort that it's coming from a legitimate business? We're not going to have a foolproof answer for you on this front. It's very difficult to steer a path through those obligations and still, I suppose, tick that box. But they're the key considerations, and it really comes down to: are you linking to commercial content? And is there a way, if you do need to include links, of addressing that issue without running the risk of having the message deemed to be commercial?
Peter, Rob, any thoughts that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, look, I'd just say that there's a bit of a shibboleth out there that a link to any external site at which there may be marketing content linked or linkable is of itself problematic. I think the key question is, as Evan said, what is the purpose? And noting that in construing the purpose, you look at what is at the destination of that link. And that doesn't mean that that destination necessarily needs to be isolated from the rest of the internet or another site, other pages in a site. But if it manifestly has even a secondary commercial purpose of landing people somewhere where they might then be enticed to go somewhere else in order to get the the marketing content, that is risky. So organisations that wish to provide links to destination websites do need to think very carefully about the landing point and what is available beyond that landing point, and whether adequate separation has been created there. I know many organisations find this problematic, and perhaps are inclined towards thinking that the regulator is uncommercial in the way these rules are applied. That's not been my experience, but similarly, many organisations do appear to start from the view that if they link and it goes to a page that doesn't manifestly have commercial content, but clearly is designed to lure people further on to commercial content, that is potentially problematic.
Well,
Yeah,
I think that.
Sorry, Rob.
Sorry.
Please go.
I think that also, though, leads to having to think about how do you provide that linked page in a way which has a consistent look and feel with the rest of your site. So if the rest of your site has socials along the bottom, promotions along the top, but your page for unsubscribe suddenly looks weirdly blank, that may well mean that the person who clicks through thinks, just a minute, have I clicked through some scam email? So I think it's a two-part thing. One is recognize the risk that Peter's mentioned, but the second part is to actually consider it as a whole rather than simply as an obligation, so that the whole of your presence needs to be reflective of that need as well.
And to add to what you've all said, we find a lot of questions that do come in. You know, we get the statement, as Peter mentioned. You know, we're always in this world a click away from a sale. But I think to go to Evan's point, if we really take a step back and look at the purpose for which we've included that link, if it really is to identify who we are, is the only way to do that to send to a big promotional page. A lot of businesses, when they stop and ask, are we actually fulfilling what we're saying we're doing? Because look, a marketer sees a bit of white space on an email. Hey, we can put a product in there. You know, if there's that little thought process which goes, maybe we can cheekily put something in, then that's when you probably do need to stop and go, okay, we're trying to add something in. We're trying to go around the law. But if you actually do think about the fact that that link will take you to a contact page to identify how you are, it's up to the business, I think, to really look at that the way Peter just mentioned. So I think where we fall into trouble as marketers and as a marketing community is where we try to push the envelope a little bit. And I think before we do that, that's when we have to take a step back and do that whole applying the strategies of what is a customer actually going to be comfortable with, and are we trying to get in an extra sale when we haven't got the reasoning for that. Okay, so sorry, has anybody got anything else to say on that, or shall we move on? Because this is probably a conversation that will continue on for a very long time, and you will, as the ACMA finds in every single investigation, have to apply it into context. Okay, so ADMA has been encouraged by the ACMA's willingness to examine use cases and to engage with the businesses that you regulate. It's been something that we thank you for that, because this helps with a lot of application. Why did the ACMA move to a statement of expectations? Why was that the thought process there?
Yeah. So just to rehash a couple of bits and pieces. So as Sam mentioned, 90% of complaints we receive about alleged breaches of spam and telemarketing laws include an issue of consent. To drill down a little bit further into the research that you mentioned, our research shows that 65% of Australians had agreed to none or only some of the unsolicited marketing communications they'd received in the previous 12 months. Just under 60% had asked the business to stop contacting them in the last 12 months, but was still contacted again by that business. And over 70% wanted more control over how their data is used by businesses to contact them for marketing. So there's a fair bit of consumer feedback that we get there, as well as feedback from the industry, including through ADMA as well. We're of the view that a regulatory guide in this space would not have been helpful because of the gaps and inconsistencies that we've mentioned, and because of that, we felt that a statement, a guide that lifted things up a little bit, was more principles based, would be more helpful for industry in particular, and would also enable us to promote best practice as well. So we've deliberately taken that path to address both the consumer sentiment, but also, the feedback we get through industry. Look, we are hopeful at some stage that there will be some legislative reform, but the reality is these things take time. And in the absence of any clarity on that front, in terms of modernising those pieces of legislation that we've been talking about today, we felt the need to step in and try and provide this advice in the interim. So I'll reiterate again, we think it helps businesses meet their minimum expectations, but also the minimum obligations, but also consumer expectations as well. And we're of the view that that's a bit of a win-win for industry. And we're hoping that it's a really useful resource.
I might just add to Evan's already excellent explanation to just say directly to all of you ADMA members that one of the core criteria that we keep front of mind in all of our work is how do we help the industries that we regulate comply? How can we improve compliance? How can we educate people about what to do to comply? And this applies across obviously our compliance and enforcement work that Evan is very focused on, but we also need to think creatively about how else we can help industry comply. And we thought that issuing this statement of expectations would be a great way of educating people without necessarily doing that within the context of an enforcement action, which is obviously a deterrent in itself. But I think as the regulator, we need to think more creatively about how we can encourage stronger compliance amongst the industry we regulate. So you will maybe see more of these types of documents coming from us.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think the other point is that we appreciate that, having to try and interpret legislation is particularly difficult, and it's something that we struggle with sometimes on a day-to-day basis as well. So to have an expectation that industry would be able to do that and clearly understand their obligations is perhaps a bit unreasonable. So that's one of the other core reasons why we've produced this guidance.
From an industry body perspective, we find it fantastic because it's something that also allows help marketers apply use case as well. So yeah, we think it's fantastic. And Evan, you made a point there about legislation taking time. I hadn't noticed, noticed that legislation takes time to reform. Wow, surprising. Okay, we're going to move to a few of the audience questions. And can I say, I think the panelists would be able to see there are a lot. So this is clearly a interesting topic for a lot of people out there, but I'm really glad to have the questions coming, as I'm sure you are from the ACMA too. Okay, I'm going to ask this first question actually was emailed in from a member prior to the webinar. Some businesses provide opt-out links in marketing SMS messages. However, there is good advice never to click on a link in an SMS. Does this mean that the opt-out of SMS must always be by sending stop to a number, and what is best practice in this regard?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I acknowledge that this is advice that we regularly provide in the context of communications about potential scam messages as well, in terms of the risk with links. The reality is that either of the approaches mentioned there, Sala, would be compliant, but ultimately it's up to the business to determine the approach that works best for them. So an alternative to having a link in there could simply just be that, reply stop to this particular number. So that takes the link out of the off the table. The only thing we just reiterate with that approach is just make sure that you're not combining that with a message that's sent from an alpha tag rather than a number. So if it's reply stop, it needs to be reply to an actual number, not an alpha tag or a sender ID. Obviously, if you're directing them to an actual phone number to reply to, then that doesn't come into the equation. So that's probably the best alternative to overcome that scenario if you are concerned about that perception.
Fantastic.
I think it's also, this would help with Peter's issue that I don't want to receive anything on SMS, but to have that, but if I'm Peter, as me, I take a similar view. I don't want marketing communications by SMS, perfectly happy to have them by email and other means. I think from a consumer perspective, if I want to opt out in channel, I really should have that availability. So actually, not only is the scam issue, but the inconvenience of having to click a link in order to unsubscribe on one channel using another it's just not a nice way of solving the problem.
Okay. Many chatbot transactions collect email addresses. What consent can be inferred from that sharing?
Yeah, okay, so that's quite a broad question, and ultimately I think it's going to be situation dependent. But as a general rule, inferred consent is far less reliable than express consent. So inferred consent generally only applies where a person has that provable ongoing relationship with your business and the marketing's directly related to that relationship. It doesn't cover sending messages after someone's just bought something from your business or has made an inquiry, and that may be where the email is provided. So you need to be very careful when automatically adding consumers to your marketing list, or at least those sorts of details. And I'll give you a practical example. Many of the people joining us on the webinar today would have received a compliance alert from the ADMA. So we send compliance alerts out as an initial informal step as part of our graduated compliance and enforcement strategy. It's a way of alerting a business to the fact that we've received a complaint and that on prima facie assessment, there may be an issue. It's not a finding, and it's not us saying we've investigated this and you're definitely in breach, but it's sort of saying, hey, look, based on the information that we've been provided, we think you may have an issue. We send out anywhere from about 6,000 to 10,000 of those a year, and we have a really good response rate in terms of lack of recidivism when we send those out. So it's a really helpful tool. But there are instances where we will send those to a business via the most relevant email address that we can find, and it's usually info at, or it might be a privacy officer address, etc. And then our address will get added to that business's marketing list, and we will start receiving marketing to our email address, spamcompliance@acma.gov.au. So that's a classic example of where there's no consent, there's no inferred business relationship that you can take out of that. It is a clear example of either a practice or a misunderstanding that is not compliant with the Spam Act. So I know that's not a chatbot example, but it sort of just gives you an idea of where some of the challenges or the risks can lie. So it really just does come back to, have you got consent? doesn't matter on what the technology is.
Can I just add on that it is important for organisations to think about the practical aspect of establishing whether they had consent or not, because once a message is correctly construed to be a commercial electronic message, the evidential burden shifts to the sender or the authoriser of the message to establish that there was consent. And that can be a difficult task if, for example, the email went through an automated process over time, because effectively you will be required to establish that consent had been obtained through whatever process over time, which may have changed depending upon the campaign or the way in which your website was set up over time. So there is always a risk when you rely upon inferred consent that you may not be able to discharge the evidential burden, either because you simply can't do it or because the weight of establishing it in respect of thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of emails sent over time is such that it is just too hard a burden to discharge. And you only need to have a handful of electronic messages that you can't establish consent to be in breach of the Act. So the evidential burden is not something to be taken lightly.
I think particularly on the chatbot case, what Peter mentioned before about transparency is important. I don't think if I've sent my email in order to get a transcript of a chatbot session, I've inferred anything other than I'd like to get a transcript of the chatbot session that I just had. And so actually just thinking about why you might think that consent has been inferred is really important. On the other hand, if I'm told, please give your email so that you can receive a transcript of the chatbot interaction, yes, please tick here if you'd like to receive marketing messages and it's not pre-filled, that looks like something completely different. So I think it's really important to get context. It's really important for transparency to be there. But those risks of inferring something that shouldn't be inferred that Peter's just run through are really significant.
And I think also, to add to what all of you have said, it's really important to keep a record of when the dates of when that consent has been obtained and then withdrawn. Many times a business, a customer may actively say, I don't want to hear from you again, and then sign up to a competition or do something and provide that consent again. And it'll be on the business, if a complaint goes through, to be able to show that the last action taken by that customer was either the withdrawal or the providing consent again. So I think those are things that quite often in a business that's not thought about. So keeping those records are really important. There've been a few questions about whether or not you're able to unsubscribe by making someone sign into an account. And I'm going to refer to that directly because it is the spam regulations, and I think that's something that people need to be knowing. Would you like to, somebody else likes to tackle it?
Yeah, sure. So thank you. So the spam regulations don't allow for you essentially to require someone to either log into or create an account in order to unsubscribe. It needs to be easy, and yeah, ideally, through an electronic address. So yeah, no.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. The other one is people have asked about unsubscribing in staff emails, and I'm just going to address this one because Evan, you and I have had conversations about this, about where if somebody has a one-to-one business relationship, there's an inferred consent, and that you really need to think about having an unsubscribe in an auto signature is not necessarily enough, because as Peter mentioned, just having the unsubscribe facility is not enough. You've actually got to keep a record of when people do that, and is it going in and being synced together to a database that is then being washed against before the next email has been sent. So part of it is not just trying to say, okay, we've met the compliance by putting in that unsubscribe facility, if it is not then going to a place that it's going to be actioned and recorded. So if any would like to add to that, but I thought I'd address that question because, Evan, we've had many discussions on that over the years.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that often the way in which a functional unsubscribe is technically enabled yokes together at least 2 or 3 systems within an organisation back to the source of truth of the CRM where the consents are registered. And I've had experience of organisations where the links within the organisation that yoke together those systems have been broken for some time, and the organisation hasn't picked up that they've been broken. So a key aspect of good spam management within an organisation should be regularly checking whether these links are active and working. And I've also seen examples where the functional unsubscribe facility has effectively fallen over and nobody's noticed for some time. And again, the way that the organisation finds out is that Evan or somebody else sends one of those notices from the ACMA, and then they discover that there's a problem. So regular hygiene checks of your technology are really important.
Evan, did you want to say anything more? Or?
I was just going to reiterate, so the requirement is that those unsubscribe requests are actioned within 5 business days. So it's not just having that facility there; they need to be actioned. And we've taken enforcement action against a number of businesses for failing to do so.
There are some questions here, quite a few, about B2B and B2C. Would anyone like to just give a couple of lines on thoughts on that? Emailing messages, I suppose is that one too hard to answer in a couple of minutes that we have left?
Well, it depends on what angle we're coming at this from. But the Act doesn't distinguish between a message sent to a private individual or to a business. The rules are essentially the same. Where the practices might be a little bit different is around inferred consent. Certainly, we see a lot of examples of businesses inferring they've got consent through conspicuous publication of someone's contact details, and what their product or service that they're offering is relevant to that business. So that's probably a specific scenario where relevant to B2B. But otherwise, most of the obligations are the same.
Yeah, one difficulty with the conspicuous publication exception is that, as Evan says, the inferences to consent is specific to the role of the individual and the link between the product and service and that role. Of course, the problem is if an organisation then ingests that email address into their system, they may not be also ingesting the specifics around the narrowness or definition of that person's role in respect of any further communication. So it may start out with a demonstrable relationship between the individual, their role, and the communication, but then that nuance gets lost in the way the sending organisation maintains its records. So really a caution on relying upon inferred consent by conspicuous publication unless your hygiene around description of the role of individuals and any limitations that flow from that as to the communications that your organisation might send, unless you're confident that that is really robust and up to date.
I think we've got time for one more, so I'm going to group a few of them together. A few of these questions have kind of come in about if an event is a free event or a free webinar and you're sending a communication about that, is that considered commercial, is one. And the other one is research and a follow-up survey from a person attending an event. I know what I would say, but is there somebody else that would like to answer that?
Well, I mean, the acts or both acts talk about, advertising and promotion. So it doesn't necessarily have to involve a commercial transaction straight away. And so, I think that very high level example to me would still fall into the promoting or advertising bucket. What was the second question, Sala?
The second part was about surveys, and if you're you've just done some kind of event and you're following up with a survey to kind of just get what the experience is, how would that be considered? Would that be considered a commercial communication? Generally,
No, we might have to deal with that one. You probably want a bit more information to be able to provide some useful advice on that one. But happy for others to have a go at it.
I don't know necessarily that it's commercial, but it's incredibly annoying. I can't tell you how annoyed I am at the number of people that want to have my feedback as to the last interaction that I had with them. It's kind of like having a needy 3-year-old for the rest of your life.
Well, on that point, I can imagine that the ones that you do answer would get that kind of, they wouldn't want to hear that response anyway.
And Sala, are we going to be sending out a feedback form after this?
So my thoughts on that one would be that when people have registered to attend an event, you probably would be letting them know what kind of communications they would be receiving after that event, and letting them know as well that they can unsubscribe from every communication. I think that the transparency, again, is a really important point. But look, I just wanted to thank you. We don't have time to run through every question, but we've got so many here, and ADMA will endeavour to provide some responses to what we can here. But I'd like to thank our amazing panellists today. This has been a fantastic session, and I thank you very much for your time and valuable insights.
Thanks, Sala.
Thanks, Sala. All the best.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all.
Now, as you can see, this is a really important area of marketing compliance, and the more that we engage and understand what is expected of businesses, the better our practices can be. ADMA would like to ask you one last poll question, not a survey, we're asking you a poll. When was the last time you accessed resources, education or training on spam compliance and its application in today's marketing landscape? If you can provide your answers to that. Okay, so the majority of answers are saying a while ago, so over a year ago. I think, as you can hear from today's conversation, it's probably not enough for us to, learn and then forget. So make sure that you continue to lean in and to look at all the resources available. To stay across the latest information and help you in this space, visit the ACMA's website to access their statement of expectations and some helpful FAQ style guidance. Also, don't forget that ADMA members have access to a range of toolkits and guidance in this space. And of course, you join me for the next Privacy and Compliance for Marketers course that's coming up in October. Watch out for your inbox for an information sheet from today's session, which will be sent this week. And I'd like to thank you all for your time today. And I look forward to continuing to talk to you all on this really interesting space. Thank you all for coming today.